confirm to join again. So I'll just give everyone a minute to be able to do that, and then we will start. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to this presentation, which looks at the experience of local government reorganisation through the lens of an internal legal department that led on all the governance changes in North Yorkshire. I'm Barry Khan. I'm the Assistant Chief Executive for Legal and Democratic Services for North Yorkshire Council and a Director on the Council's wholly owned legal firm, First North Law. I was also the Monitoring Officer of the County Council prior to reorganisation. I'm joined by Jennifer Norton, who was one of the monitoring officers of one of the borough councils prior to reorganisation. So Jen, do you just want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Barry. Hi, as you say, my name is Jennifer Norton, and I'm the Assistant Director for Legal and the Deputy Monitoring Officer at North Yorkshire Council. Prior to reorganisation, I was, again, as Barry said, the Monitoring Officer of one of the boroughs, and as such was involved throughout the local government reorganisation process and was part of a team that helped to ensure that the new unitary could operate safely and legally from vesting day. Thanks, Barry.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Jen. And it's probably helpful to say as well, I think from our area, and you'll hear from this, the county had proposing one particular bid and the districts were proposing an alternative bid as well. So it's good to show at the end of reorganisation, even though as politicians they were kind of divide, together as officers we can kind of come together and work well together through this process as well. So I know some of you listening to this will be waiting for a decision on reorganisation, and from my point of view, and we'll go on it through a high level, it's about ensuring that as officers you work very closely together, because reorganisation requires a lot of work and a lot of collaboration. So today we want to provide a presentation that we hope people going through this process will find useful and told firsthand by internal council staff that went through this process. So this is the story about how two tiers in local government in North Yorkshire became one. And I've completely insisted on this reference to the Spice Girls songs, which all my staff and even my children hate and think it's not funny, but I'm going to keep ploughing on through it. So you'll just have to bear with me. So today this presentation is being delivered in partnership with YPO's Legal Services Framework. So YPO, Yorkshire Purchasing Organisation, is wholly owned by the public sector, and it provides a legal and value for money route to get access to lawyers. We, as First North Law, that I'm presenting today as, are one of 6 providers across 13 different lots, covering a full range of legal services for the entire public sector. So that's the only hard sell that we're giving today in our presentation. I would just basically say, so First North Law is a wholly owned company by North Yorkshire Council. So every penny that's spent within First North Law stays within the public sector. I am, I've been a local government lawyer for over 25 years. I've been a monitoring officer for 20 years. I married a local government lawyer. I've got 2 kids that, unless AI takes over all the jobs in the future, I'm going to try and push to be local government lawyers. So it's something that we kind of care really passionately about. So moving swiftly on, just for those who don't know where North Yorkshire is, if you're coming by space and want to see where it is, this is where we are as base. We're the geographically biggest local authority in the country, and we cover a vast area. That's us a bit above Leeds and a bit below Darlington. So prior to reorganisation, this is what the structure looked like, and this slide shows that the 8 councils within North Yorkshire that existed prior to reorganisation, there were 7 district and borough councils and 1 county council. The presentation will go through at a high level the process we followed to create 1 council of North Yorkshire Council as a unitary. So this slide shows the various stages of the process, from the initial bid to the creation of the new authority. We discussed the process in 6 stages. It starts with the bid, then the decision by the Secretary of State, the passing of the structural changes order, then the election of members to the new authority, the potential to put spending restrictions on predecessor councils, and then finally the vesting day for the new authority. We will also Jen will go through the creation of town councils and community governance reviews that were undertaken to fulfil promises that were made as part of reorganisation. So firstly, looking at that first stage, we look at the bid. As you will all be aware, the process of submitting bids to government on what the council should look like after reorganisation can be a time for political tension, as competing bids can be submitted. Within our area, there were 2 alternative bids, and each bid used a different governance model for the basis of the creation of the new councils. Whilst it is important for colleagues and the public to understand that under either model, there is a new council or councils that are being created, from a legal perspective, there are basically 2 types of governance models. Firstly, the new legal entity model. This looks at legally creating a brand new legal entity that will form the basis of the council or councils. Prior to the creation of these new councils, there will be a shadow authority and a shadow executive created that will be able to make decisions on behalf of the new organisation prior to all staff and assets being transferred to the new authority. So that's the first model. The second type of model is what government call a continuing authority model. That particular terminology is actually not found in legislation, but is what central government refer to when an existing council is used as the basis of the creation of the new council. And this, instead of having a shadow authority, this has what is known as a preparing council and an implementation executive to make the necessary decisions on behalf of the new unitary council before it is created. So in North Yorkshire, there are 2 alternative bids, one for creating 2 new legal entities to have an east-west divide, and there was one for having the continuing authority, which was creating 1 council on the geographical basis of the county council. So then after the bid stage, government was then asked to make a decision on these 2 competing bids, and the Secretary of State carried out the necessary consultation and considered both bids. On the 21st of July 2021, the decision was made to approve the bid to create North Yorkshire Council on a continuing authority basis. And once the government had made the decision, that's when officers, everyone felt they could kind of work very closely together. So the councils needed to organise ourselves to create a governance structure for decisions to be made. From a legal side, the civil servants for government will then start drafting the structural change order, which will implement the changes. We found personally that working with the central government civil servants to be a really positive experience. They were willing to listen to our views, help ensure that the structural change order reflected any local issues. They were very clear with us that the actual drafting of the order itself is for them. They were very precious that our lawyers don't draft the order, they have lawyers that do that. But they were very willing to listen to what was needed to be included. And I would say, and a helpful hint from me, would be having really good working relationships with the civil servants who are assigned to your reorganisation is really helpful. So still after the decision was made, looking at the actual process, it was important that we had a real strong programme management strategy for all the councils to work together to create the new council. We split the work out into a number of work streams for officers, as shown in this slide, to ensure that there was a safe and legal new authority. So it's a very busy slide, but you can see my name somewhere in there. I was the project sponsor for the governance work stream and was assisted by a very talented team that looked at all the legal and governance issues involved in creating the new North Yorkshire Council. Every workstream sponsor, you'll see there was a number of sponsors, there's lots of work to be done, there's IT, HR, a whole range of stuff that needed to be done. And every sponsor can talk to you directly and talk through a different kind of process, and they'll have a different view and they'll look at it through a different lens about what reorganisation meant. It's a big process. This particular presentation looks at it purely from the legal elements of the transfer. So after the decision was made, we thought we needed to be able to gather ourselves together with regards to officers and members and make sure that we had a consistent approach going forward. So this slide, which I'll go into in a bit more detail, looks at the decision-making structures that we implemented. We tried to ensure that we had a consistent approach of engaging with members and officers from all councils from after the decision was made until the new organisation was created. We knew that there would be 3 main stages of decision making prior to the creation of the new authority. Firstly, there'd be a period of time after a decision was made, but before the making of the structural change order. So there's no set rules, there's no legislation which says how you formulate your decision making during that process. So what we did was to look what the future processes would be and mirror that decision making and implement that at an early stage. So this was the second stage in the process. The third stage in the process was after the councillors were elected to run the new council, but before the council was created. So this complicated slide shows that there were 3 stages of decision making which we created, and I'll talk about them individually as we go forward. So going to the first stage of that process, for when the decision was made, but before the order was passed. So we had 2 competing bids, and then the Secretary of State stated one particular bid was what they were going to implement, but they hadn't actually drafted the structural change order yet. So our decision-making process is shown in this slide. We wanted to create a structure that would engage with, for us, all 8 councils that were in the area through informal arrangements that would mirror the formal structure that was to come. This would allow work to commence to create the new authority and enable a smooth transition to when the formal arrangements were put in place. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, and the sooner this could start, the better. So we were really keen to put this structure in place as soon as the decision was made. Also, it was helpful in building up a one-team approach to create the new authority and to provide a platform for members and officers to come together to implement the government's decision. When you have had officers and members working on competing bids, this is a really good time to come together and collaborate on the considerable amount of work that is needed to create this new council, or new councils in your case. Starting at the top of this slide, we show that the predecessor councils are still sovereign, but we try to create an informal joint committee of members from all councils, including their leaders, to work together to oversee the traditional work on a political level. The transitional work, so the work that you need to do to create the new authority on a political level. And while the politicians may have favoured competing bids, we try to get them together to say whatever their previous decisions were, they now needed to work together to ensure that the implementation of the new structure, which some of them didn't support, could come together and be implemented. So politically, it can be a challenging time. As monitoring officers, it can be a challenging time advising your existing councils as well. And it's just a recognition that you need to deal with that in the usual way that your legal advisors and monitoring officers do. We advise the local authority, not individual officers, and we make sure that we comply with the law. Going back to the decision making, so underneath the informal joint committee, we created an officer group. So we created an informal implementation board. This was of chief executives and senior officers from all councils. And they sponsored the various work streams that were needed to be able to implement the new council. Underneath, we had something what we called the implementation plan, which was project managed to ensure that we had a coordinated approach in working on the work streams. So the implementation plan was our document, which was a living document, which said, this is how we're going to try and achieve vesting date. So the next stage was when the government passed the structural change order. It then formally created in law the implementation arrangements. It created for us an implementation executive. If you're having new authorities, it would create a shadow executive, which works exactly the same, which is a committee of members from all the councils and an implementation team of officers. Both of these bodies then, under the order, have a legal duty to create an implementation plan, which is the document which describes how we will ensure a smooth transition from all the predecessor councils to the new council. And it's at this stage that the interim head of paid service, the interim chief finance officer, and the interim monitoring officer were appointed. So for us, we made all of those appointments internally from existing staff, which they did alongside their day job. And there are alternative models that can be made. In addition, at this stage, you've got the structural change order in place. You can start the formal TUPE consultation, because in law, you have the transitional arrangements and they're on the statute books. From our experience, what worked well is that we used internal resource as much as possible to ensure that there was real ownership of the outcomes for the new authority, and only supplemented that core work with external consultants where it was sensible and necessary to do so. From my perspective, it was important that we used internal legal, democratic and election staff as much as possible, so that we ensure that the new arrangements worked well and were widely understood. So you need to supplement some experience for people that have gone through the process before or experts on the process, but it's really important we found, even from drafting the bid to going through the process, is that you have internal staff that own the process, understand it, and make sure it's known across the board. This slide shows how those arrangements worked with the informal joint committee of members that we had previously, prior to the order being made, being substituted by a formal implementation executive. So that's at the top level. The level below then shows the implementation team of officers, where officers continue to work on the implementation plan, but now this had legal force and there was a legal duty on all the councils to cooperate in preparing the implementation plan. This phase for us only lasted just over about 2 months, but it was helpful that we already had a working arrangement in place which mirrored that arrangement. So although it was already only 2 months, we already had those arrangements previously, and we had councils and officers working together to try and kind of implement the new stages. And kind of my lessons learned from my point of view is to try and ensure that you get as many officers freed up in that stage to be involved with the new authority. It can be really hard because you're trying to do your existing workload, you're trying to ensure that your existing council is sovereign. But going forward, we need to get as many people involved in the new organisation, being part of that kind of implementation strategy going forward. The more people involved, the better, because it'll be a softer landing on day one. Then for us, next stage was elections to the new authority. So soon after the passing of the order, we held elections for the new authority. This was a vital stage of the process to ensure that we had elected officials in place who would ultimately oversee the new council so they can make the necessary decisions to enable a smooth transition from the 8 councils into one. Our members and government recognised that the newly elected members had the democratic mandate and authority to make decisions going forward, even though we continued to have 8 councils in existence at this time. So how did that work for us? Well, the county council previously had 72 councillors, and then there was about over 200 councillors in the district and borough councils. After we had the elections in May 2022, we increased the number of county councillors to 90. So we increased the number of county councillors because we were a continuing authority model. And then the executive of that council acted as the implementation executive for the new council. An interesting part of the bid was that we had to state what the number of councillors would be for the new authority, and then also come up with what the boundaries would be. So that was quite a big piece of work that we had to do to say, for a new unitary council of the same geography as the county council, what were the right number of councillors, and how do you ensure you get the balance right of making effective savings by not having too many, but having the right number of councillors that can do their democratic work. So we did a huge piece of work and we came up with the number of 90 councillors with a proposed geography. Once the council was created, actually, we then had a boundary review. So within the first term of the creation of the new authority, the Boundary Commission will do a boundary review. And actually, I would say this, wouldn't I? We got it quite right. So instead of having 90 councillors, I think the review is going to push for 89 councillors, changing and tweaking the geography, but the existing geography for those 90 councillors and the new divisions have worked well for us. With regard to the newly elected members that you've got in place now, so you've still got all your predecessor councils in place, but you've got your new councillors. You can work with those newly elected members. We work closely with them to create the new constitution, looked at the committee structure that they would like the new authority to have. We had working groups on what licensing committees, planning committees and scrutiny committees would look like. So it's really helpful after the elections, where you've got those councillors that'll be running the new council, to sit with them, look at drafting the constitution, look at what rules they would like to apply for the new authority. And really important for us as lawyers, make sure that they've got really strong, good schemes of delegations in place to be able to ensure that committees and officers can make the relevant decisions on day one. So the decision-making structure after elections, which is shown in this slide, and before vesting date, was that the executive of the newly elected councillors took over as the implementation executive, and we had new members in place who could make decisions and have ownership of their decisions after vesting date. The implementation team of officers underneath remained the same, excuse me, but we now had greater certainty that political decisions could be implemented, because it was those councillors that were going to stay and make those decisions going forward. It was a good time to get the constitution of the council ready and in place for day one, and ensure, like we've said before, that they've got appropriate governance, scrutiny committees, licensing committees in place. And I would say this, I think it's important that you get it in day one, but it's even more important to say the constitution is a living document. Those councillors and those officers, we haven't actually seen how these new unitary council or councils will work. We need something in place on day one, but we'll keep it under review. And we made a promise that within the first 12 months, we'll do a review of our constitution, see if how it was working for all the members and officers, and then make changes as we go through. So the next part that I wanted to talk about, which isn't a compulsory part, but it is something that's happening more and more with regards to reorganisations, is looking at restrictions on spending by predecessor councils. So this is after the elections have taken place, but before the creation of the new council. So after the elections, the Secretary of State has the discretion to issue a direction which puts certain restrictions on the councils prior to vesting date to ensure that sensible long-term financial decisions are made, and that councils that are no longer going to exist after vesting date do not make decisions that are not in the best interest of the future of the new council. This is known as a Section 24 notice or direction, and it means that the implementation executive will have to give approval for certain revenue expenditure over £100,000 and certain capital expenditure over £1 million prior to vesting date. In the case of North Yorkshire, such a direction was issued, and there was really helpful work across all the Section 151 officers of the 8 councils to ensure that prior to the issuing of that notice, there was already an informal protocol in place to ensure that expenditure of taxpayers' money was being appropriately scrutinised. After the passing of the order, the implementation executive then considered a report. We drafted a report for the implementation executive to consider to grant a general consent for certain expenditure so that predecessor councils did not have to ask for permission for every bit of expenditure which breached the stated thresholds. So, you know, if you had things that were already in your budget, you were making decisions, you were doing, for example, a bin waste out procurement. If there are things that were already approved and were sensible to do, we considered and our members gave a general consent for it. And what they said was, there any new projects, potentially any vanity projects, well, then these can be paused and you need to get the implementation executive approval so that decisions can be made across the region to make sure that it was sensible decisions were being made and people weren't just spending money on bad ideas just because they thought their councils were no longer going to exist in the future. Because from our experience, you know, we're a couple of years after reorganisation, you know, with finances being what they are, it's important to ensure that sensible decisions are made across all the councils and protecting the public's purse. So for us, an area that worked well was while there were some demands for large expenditures to be made in certain areas before the expiring of the predecessor council, it was helpful to ensure that this strategic approach was taken so longer term considerations can be made for the new council. After vesting date, in my experience, members of the new council will still want to ensure that expenditure is spent wisely in the locality, and therefore this process under Section 24 can act as a helpful safeguard to protect decisions that should rightly be made by the newly elected councillors with their democratic mandate to run the new council. And then finally, we got on to vesting date, which for us was the 1st of April 2023. This was a monumental day for us, created the new authority, and we ensured that we delivered on our ambition to be safe and legal on day one. We had a bit of a mantra coming up to this across all 8 councils that we wanted to be safe and legal. And, you know, the lessons that some areas we could have been a bit more ambitious, some areas we probably were a bit too ambitious, but being safe and legal was really important, that we created on day one a functioning local authority that could make decisions in an appropriate manner. So a considerable amount of work was undertaken across a number of disciplines and was delivered, as I've said before, by this hugely talented and dedicated team of colleagues. There was a lot of work that was done by the legal, democratic and election team at this point, and we produced a helpful guide to staff about what the regulations provided with regard to the transfer of land, contracts, functions to the new authority. So as well as having your own individual structural change order, there are a series of regulations that apply to all reorganisations, and these deal with how all the council's assets and liabilities will transfer across. The actual details of that, a lot of that are in the 2008 regulations, probably a bit too detailed for this presentation, but again, if you email me, we're very happy to share details of our survival guide, of how it worked, how it kind of reassures staff regards to prosecutions that are being brought, enforcement notices that are being brought, how they continue going forward, what happens with contracts, what happens with staff, which I know Jen will talk about going forward as well. For those councils that are still waiting for a decision, I get asked, what is it helpful to do? What can we do with our time? Because we're all geared up for it. We know this ton of work's going to happen. What can we do in the interim? I think, from my experience, I'm sure Jen will tell you from her experience, it's about information. So for me, it's about helpful to understand what contracts each councils have, what land they own, what are the future procurement pipelines, what litigation's going on. I know it sounds very boring, but producing lists of information about what are your assets and liabilities is really helpful, because when you all merge together as one, or you split up into two, it's really important that information is king. So we got through vesting date, and just when you thought all the hard work had been done in creating this new authority or authorities, the regulation provides that there are a number of policies that the new authority must make as soon as practicable, but no later than 2 years from vesting date. And these policies are listed here on the slide, and they're related to housing, licensing, and council tax. Really helpfully, within the 2008 regulations, there are some saving provisions, which mean that many existing policies continue until the council renews them. So you can have different, so policies that have been done by an ex-county or an ex-district can continue as they are until you reviewed them. However, these 6 policies need to be done within the next, from the 2 years of creation, and then we have a couple of policies that need to be done within the first 5 years. So these 2 policies that relate to your local plan for planning and council tax equalisations, they have to be done within 5 years from vesting date. And I'll just reiterate the point about the saving provisions within the 2008 regulations, which say that you don't have to have the same charging policies across the new council. You can have different car parking charges, different charges for leisure services, if that's what your members want. What you try not to do is trying to harmonise everything on day one. You try and deal with it in stages and see what's appropriate to deal with in day one and what can be done after that day and can be done appropriately. So we're just in over 2 years with regards to, coming up to 2 years with regards to our reorganisation, coming up to 3 years with regards to our reorganisation in April, and we still have different charging for leisure facilities within our ex-district areas as well. But we've tried to harmonise other areas. So where it's appropriate to do so, do so. Where it can wait or where you want differential points, they can have as well, and the legislation allows that to happen. So then, thankfully, you'll be glad to hear that's the you won't hear from me for a while as I pass you over to Jen. So Jen, can you wake all the audience up and then tell them much more interesting things about staffing, which I'm sure is of real interest to people that work in local government.
Thanks, Barry. Well, I think that's right. I think one of the most common questions raised and going through the reorganisation process is, well, what does it actually mean for me as an employee? Of what will become or what is a predecessor council, and what does it mean for my job? Relevant here are the staffing regulations, and the full title is on the PowerPoint. And broadly speaking, they have the effect that employees of predecessor councils will enjoy the protections afforded by CHIPI. So as I'm sure people are familiar with the concept of CHIPI, that means you transfer on your current terms and conditions. And importantly, if there are any dismissals by reason of redundancy ahead of vesting date in connection with the transfer, then they're likely to be automatically unfair. And there are also some very specific provisions regarding the recruitment, appointment and dismissal of heads of paid service and other chief officers. Government, if you ask them, are likely to say that you as the local authority need to take your own legal advice, both in terms of the interpretation of the legislation and how it applies in specific situations. That's something that we here in North Yorkshire would absolutely advocate doing. It's something which all of the authorities in North Yorkshire did ahead of vesting day as part of the reorganisation process. There is a helpful explanatory memorandum that accompanies the regulations, and also the government department had issued some guidance on staffing issues in 2008. Now, I understand that the government intend to reissue that guidance in due course. So if they do that, it will obviously be worth looking at. The 2008 guidance does reference chief executives of predecessor councils for whom there is no alternative post on transfer. And it talks about the situation of them being likely to be made redundant. It also references that there's nothing to prevent chief executives or other senior officers in predecessor councils from reaching agreements with their existing employers as to terms of severance if they wish to leave prior to reorganisation. What I would caution is that if you are thinking of going down that route of voluntary severance or of agreeing a local staffing protocol, then you need to be very mindful of a number of things in terms of who could authorise that, and in particular the statutory guidance on the making and disclosure of special severance payments by local authorities. And that's especially the case if you're thinking of making payments in lieu of notice. So think carefully about that. As I say, I definitely take advice on that independent of your authorities. Think about the process you'll need for disclosure and whether you'll need to involve your auditors in that process. And moving on to the next slide, I think I might be temporarily handing back to you, Barry.
Thank you.
Oh, no, I'm not. Sorry, my apologies. I'm going to talk about town and parish councils.
You can tell we've rehearsed this, can't you?
Sorry, that was not very smooth. So yes, moving on to town and parish councils. They're obviously independent institutions in that they're separate legal entities from the preparing council, the shadow council, or any of the predecessor councils. And I know that sounds very obvious, but there is out there a common misconception that the new unitary authority will somehow be the parent authority, a bit like in the corporate world in terms of groups of companies, and that the new unitary is somehow responsible for resolving all parish and town council governance issues, or stepping in when they're not functioning as they should. Now, depending on the size of the new unitary, you may end up with lots of parish or town councils in your area. I think, Barry, that we hold the record on this, as we've got 729 parish areas with 412 town and parish councils. What I would advise, and this is from experience, is that you think very carefully about what support and processes you will need to be in place from vesting day to support the monitoring officer of the new unitary when it comes to considering standards complaints from town and parish councils, or just general queries from those organisations. Town and parish councils, when they're functioning properly, have got a lot to offer, and you may be of the view that there's not enough in your geographical area, and so you want to create more. The process for creating town and parish councils is a community governance review. And then it's a separate process if you're considering devolving powers and transferring assets to town and parish councils as part of the reorganisation. In our experience, both community governance reviews and what we call double devolution, so devolving functions, assets, and possibly some services to town and parish councils, both of those processes take a lot of officer time and resource. So it is important to look at where this fits into your reorganisation work plan and that you have sufficient resource allocated to it. Just moving to the next slide, please. In Harrogate and Scarborough, both of those predecessor councils have been granted borough status as a result of the last major local government reorganisation back in 1974. So that meant that both Harrogate and Scarborough had mayors and a deputy mayor, together with a number of other ceremonial and historic privileges. In the run-up to structural change, we were aware that there wouldn't be any suitable local government bodies, such as a town or a parish council, in the Scarborough and Harrogate area to continue with those historic traditions. So we had two options. We could undertake a community governance review and create new town or parish councils in those areas ahead of reorganisation, or we could use the mechanism of charter trustees. Because of the time and resource constraints, we opted for the mechanism of charter trustees, which can be established as part of the structural change order to preserve historic property rights and privileges and traditions that have been enjoyed by the residents in those areas, and without having a charter trustee organisation in place, then in the absence of a town and parish council, those rights and historical privileges would be lost. So what are charter trustees? Well, they're comprised of the councillors in the wards or divisions which cover the unparished areas where the boroughs were. It doesn't create a lower tier of local authority. So unlike town and parish councils, charter trustees don't have general powers in respect of any functions or services within the area, but rather the trustee body is there to be responsible for ensuring the continuance of those historical, ceremonial and social links of the town. Now again, up on the PowerPoint is the reference to the relevant regulations which set out the provisions under which the charter trustees can operate. They can set an annual budget to cover their running costs, and they are a precepting authority in the same way that town and parish councils are. But it's worth noting that in the first year, it's the principal authority that's responsible for funding the charter trustees, not the mechanism of a precept. So again, reflecting back on what we did in North Yorkshire, then in order for the charter trustees to be established from vesting day, there was a reasonable amount of preparatory work required. And what we did was we set up a charter trustee member working group, which consisted of those councillors who were going to become charter trustees, to work through a number of the practical matters to ensure that there was a smooth and orderly transition to the first annual meeting of both the Scarborough and the Harrogate Charter Trustees. And that annual meeting needs to take place within 6 weeks of vesting day, which flies by because it's a very busy period, as I'm sure you can imagine. So some of the things that those working group of members looked at were around identifying, well, what is the historic property that's going to be retained by the charter trustees? Who's going to be nominated for mayor and deputy mayor and their roles, and what events and engagements they will look to undertake in those areas. As officers, we were engaged to help draft standing orders and the constitution for the charter trustees, together with a mayoral handbook, and looking at practical things such as when and where the annual meeting is going to take place, any officer support that's required, and what is the budget for the first year of the charter trustees. Now, hopefully I'm right now, Barry, in saying I'm going to hand back to you now, so I've got it right this time.
Let's see. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Thank you, Jen. Yeah, so really helpful from Jen, and also it's just kind of reflecting. So this was a period of time where we worked to create a new unitary council. As Jen explained, we created 2 new town councils, but also at the same time, we worked with our colleagues in York to create a new mayoral combined authority as well at the same time. So from a governance point of view, we really went for the whole spectrum of changes and trying to implement them at the time. So this slide basically is a slide which is a monitoring officer survival guide. I think is what we all wish somebody would kind of have talked to us with hindsight and said what you needed to do with regards to creating a whole series of changes that you might only do once in your career. So, and like I say, I think we did about 3 different processes that I was hoping only to do once in my career at the same time. So this is just a slide to be a bit self-indulgent for monitoring officers and the local government lawyers going through the process. So for me, one of the lessons learned is probably not underestimating the human element of change and the unknown. So as you're going through this process, many of you, so from ourselves included, it's the first time we're going through a massive reorganisation process. You have a range of monitoring officers, a range of senior staff who are concerned, about their own roles while still having to provide leadership to their team. So I think it's really important that leadership to the teams happens, and that you get peer support for yourselves across the board as well, from wherever you can get that, whether it's mentoring, whether it's speaking to other monitoring officers, to ensure that you're providing great leadership for your teams going forward. In my experience, I think monitoring officers have it inbuilt into their own DNA that they want to do what's best for the organisation, kind of act as a moral compass of the organisation, and ensure that there's a smooth transition. And from my perspective, the sooner that you can get your monitoring officers, your lawyers working together, communicating with each other, and working on this big, new, exciting project of reorganisation, the better. And I know it can be difficult because you can have people are still trying to deliver politically their own agenda and their own messages, and they've got day-to-day work that's going on as well. But I can't underestimate the need to be able to work together and build that collaborative approach, because after day one, you're all going to be a team anyway, like it or not. So the sooner you can build those arrangements, the better. And again, in my experience, especially just talking about local government lawyers, we're all kind of cut from the same cloth, really. We're not that different, whether you work in one area or another area, whether you work for a county or a district. Ultimately, at the heart of it, you actually want to provide a great service to your residents. And I think we're more bound together by a common good than divided by the way that it actually operates. Other bits that I thought were quite interesting, and I think Jen can talk about this with from a borough perspective, is that you have lots of heads of paid service wanting to know what's happening with their particular role, and the regulations provide that the chief exec role will be advertised out, and how that works and operates, again providing advice to the authority and not to individuals. It can sometimes be tricky, but it's ensuring that you rely on your statutory protections as a monitoring officer to give the best advice to the organisation. Also, I think through the process, there can be mistrust through different organisations, through people putting different bids, and people always think that somebody else or another council or a bunch of officers or members know more than the others, and it's rarely, if ever, true. Therefore, I think once a decision is made on the new structure, I think colleagues, again, need to come together, need to ensure that you give lots of information out, because rumours and mistrust will build in silence, I think. So if you're not telling people, even if it's that we don't know what's happening or we haven't had a decision yet, keeping people informed is really important. And again, I think from my bit within North Yorkshire, what we found really hard, and just let me just talk for the legal teams, I'm sure Jen can talk from the elections teams as well, which is all the same, and from democratic services, you need good local government people in the new organisation. Everyone starts thinking, oh, it's going to mean jobs are going to be lost and everything else. Well, TUPE applies, everything goes across. People start leaving in areas where they don't feel that they know what's going on. For me, one of the hardest things was trying to keep people in place to make sure that we have good staff going forward. And again, similar to that, is trying not to give everything over to external consultants. You want people that are going to own the process as we go forward, people that are going to stay in those seats and run the new council, support the new council, to try and get involved as much as you can from your internal legal teams, to make sure that the people that are giving the advice aren't people that walk away from it, is really important. So that's coming to the end of our presentation. I told you I was going to shoehorn the Spice Girl reference in with regards to that, but I've got no one brave enough to sing the revised words to Two Becomes One, and I won't let anyone do it. What I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to stop the recording and then just open it up to a question and answer session for Jen and I. So I just want to create a safe space for people. If they want to ask any questions, they can do so at the moment, but I'm just going to stop the recording now and just thank people for attending. So